This hiker filmed a beast in Vermont, and what the camera caught next is absolutely terrifying. I should have left that October morning when I found 18-inch footprints around my cabin. 5 toes. No claws. Something with hands had been watching me sleep. 3 nights earlier, I'd caught something impossible in my footage, a figure moving through the trees, covering 6 feet with every stride. The thermal camera later showed it weighed 600 pounds and stood 7 feet tall. But here's what still haunts me. They entered my locked cabin while I slept, used my laptop, left my photos of them displayed on screen. They wanted me to know they were studying me as carefully as I was studying them. On my final night, it came to my window. That face, almost human, but grotesquely wrong. When I raised my camera for the shot that would prove everything, it shook its head. Disappointed. I lowered the camera and pressed my hand against the glass instead. So did it. 6 months later, they sent me footage showing they'd been watching since day one. What did that handshake mean? And why am I still alive? The assignment came through at the last minute. A nature magazine needed someone to document the fall foliage transition in the Northeast Kingdom after their regular photographer broke his leg. 2 weeks, good pay, and all I had to do was capture the kind of autumn shots that end up on calendars and screensavers. Simple enough for someone with 8 years of wildlife photography under their belt. The drive up from Boston took 4 hours through increasingly empty country. By the time I reached St. Johnsbury, the afternoon sun was already casting long shadows through the maples. I met the cabin owner at a mobile station just off Route 2, a weathered local named Frank, who handed over the keys while barely making eye contact. "Cabin's got everything you need," he said, leaning against my Subaru while I topped off the tank. "Generator's full, water's on, propane's good for cooking. Cell service gets spotty past Peacham, but there's a landline if you need it." I nodded, checking my phone. 3 bars. Not terrible. "Hunting season started early this year," Frank continued, his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the station. "Wear orange if you're hiking. Bears are active too, had a sow with cubs spotted near Harvey's Pond last week. And," he paused, rubbing the stubble on his jaw, "best to stay clear of the ridgelines after dark, especially the ones running north toward Burke Mountain." "Bears?" I asked. "Among other things." He pushed off from my car and started walking toward his truck. "Locals don't go up there at night. Haven't for years. You just stick to the marked trails during daylight, you'll be fine." The warning should have registered more than it did. But I was already thinking about golden hour light filtering through the foliage, about the portfolio shots this assignment could yield. I'd photographed grizzlies in Montana, wolves in Alaska. Vermont black bears didn't concern me much. The logging road to the cabin turned off Route 2, about 3 miles past Peacham. My Subaru's suspension groaned over washouts and exposed granite as we climbed. The road narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the car, and I started wondering if Frank had given me the wrong directions. Then the forest opened into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin sat like something from another era, rough-hewn logs dark with age, a stone chimney, windows that reflected the surrounding trees like black mirrors. Dense forest pressed in from all sides, leaving maybe 30 feet of open ground around the structure. The silence hit me immediately when I cut the engine. Not peaceful quiet, the complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves, just nothing. I unloaded my gear quickly, that silence making me move faster than necessary. The Canon 5D Mark IV, the 600mm telephoto, the FLIR thermal camera I'd bought used but still couldn't really afford everything, went inside before dusk settled over the clearing. The cabin's interior was basic but functional. Wood stove, gas, cooktop, a table that would work for reviewing footage on my laptop. The bedroom window looked out into solid forest, trees so close I could have reached out and touched them. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, I kept thinking about Frank's warning about the ridgelines, the way he'd said, among other things, with that 1,000-yard stare. Outside, the forest remained unnaturally quiet except for the occasional crack of a branch or settling of the cabin's old bones. Around midnight, something heavy walked across the porch, probably a raccoon, I told myself, though it sounded bigger, much bigger. I'd been hired to photograph beautiful dying leaves. That's all. 2 weeks in the Vermont wilderness, away from the noise and deadlines of Boston. What could be more straightforward? If I'd known what was watching me from those trees, studying my movements, learning my routine, I would have driven back down that logging road and never looked back. But I didn't know. Not yet. The first 3 days fell into an easy rhythm. Up before dawn to catch the morning mist rolling through the valleys. Coffee and oatmeal while reviewing the previous day's shots. Then out into the forest with 40 pounds of camera gear, chasing perfect light through stands of sugar maple and paper birch. The Northeast Kingdom in October is something else. Every turn in the trail revealed another composition: backlit leaves, glowing like stained glass, fungi clustered on rotting logs, spiderwebs jeweled with dew. I worked methodically, switching between the wide angle for landscapes and the telephoto for detail shots of individual leaves. The magazine wanted variety, and I was delivering. My daily pattern became predictable. Dawn, shoots, from 5:30 to 8. Back to the cabin for breakfast and to charge batteries. Editing and uploading selected shots through the sketchy satellite internet from 9 to noon. Lunch, usually instant ramen or canned soup, then back out for the golden hour from 4 until dusk. The light in those late afternoon hours made everything look like it was on fire. But something felt off about these woods. It took me 2 days to identify what bothered me. During certain stretches of trail, particularly the sections that ran closest to those northern ridgelines, Frank had mentioned the forest went completely silent, not the normal quiet of animals avoiding a human. This was different. Total absence of life. No squirrels chattering, no birds calling, even the insects seemed to vanish. These dead zones lasted maybe 2 or 3 minutes as I hiked through. Then gradually the normal forest sounds would return. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder during those silent stretches. That primitive part of your brain, the part that kept our ancestors alive, kept sending warning signals. But warning me about what? I never saw anything unusual. No fresh bear sign, no mountain lion tracks. Just that oppressive silence and the feeling of being observed. On the second day, I discovered what looked like a game trail running parallel to the main hiking path, about 30 yards into the forest. It was wider than a deer trail should be, the ground worn smooth and hard-packed. I followed it for maybe 50 feet before the silence became so intense it felt like pressure in my ears. I backed out and returned to the marked trail, making a mental note to explore it properly later, with the telephoto. From a distance, the editing sessions in the cabin became my favorite part of the day. Safe inside 4 walls, laptop warm on the scarred wooden table, I could lose myself in color correction and composition. The photos were good, really good. The kind of shots that get picked up by major publications. My client would be thrilled. But I kept finding myself drawn to the backgrounds of the images, searching for something I couldn't name, zooming in on dark spaces between trees, looking for patterns in the shadows. Once, I spent 20 minutes examining what looked like a face in the bark of a distant oak, only to realize it was just pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. The third evening, I hiked farther than usual, following a ridge trail that offered spectacular valley views. The sun was already touching the western mountains when I started back, and I picked up my pace. Frank's warning echoed in my head as shadows lengthened between the trees. I was still a mile from the cabin when full darkness fell. That's when I heard the first knock. A single, deliberate impact against wood, somewhere off to my left, like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. I stopped, headlamp beam sweeping the forest. Nothing. I waited 30 seconds, then continued walking. Another knock, this time from the right, closer, then silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I ran the last quarter mile, gear bag bouncing against my back, trying to convince myself it was just branches falling or a woodpecker working late, but woodpeckers don't work in total darkness, and falling branches don't follow you. The cabin's porch light had never looked so welcoming. I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't bothered with the previous nights. Through the window, my headlamp beam reflected back from the tree line, creating the illusion of eyes in the darkness. Just the light reflecting, I told myself, nothing more. That third evening changed everything. After securing the cabin, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, trying to focus on editing, but really just listening to the forest outside. Every small sound made me tense. Around 9 p.m., I forced myself to review the day's footage, needing the distraction of work. The shots were spectacular. Golden light pouring through the canopy, individual leaves like flames against the darkening sky. I was adjusting the color balance on a wide valley pan when something in the background caught my eye. just a dark shape, barely visible between distant trees. Probably a shadow or a dead snag. I zoomed in. The shape had definition vertical, distinctly separate from the surrounding trees. I clicked through to the next frame. It had moved. Not much, maybe 10 feet. But it had definitely changed position. Frame by frame, I tracked its progress across maybe 30 yards of forest, roughly 300 yards from where I'd been standing. The timestamp read 6:47 p.m. I remembered that moment, clearly adjusting my polarizing filter, waiting for a cloud to pass. I hadn't seen anything unusual, hadn't heard anything, but there it was in the footage, moving with a fluid, purposeful gait that made my skin crawl. I enhanced the image, pushed the ISO correction to its limit. The figure became a pixelated mess, but the proportions were all wrong for a bear. Too upright, too tall, and the way it moved, each stride covered impossible ground. A bear's walk is rolling, almost comical. This thing moved like an athlete, smooth and controlled. Black bears stand about 6 feet on their hind legs. This figure, even at that distance, appeared taller, much taller. But whenever I tried to focus on specific details, a face, hands, anything definitive, the image quality fell apart into digital noise. I exported the clearest frames and opened them in different software, trying every enhancement technique I knew. Nothing helped. It was like trying to photograph smoke. The more I magnified, the less I could see. But I knew what I was looking at wasn't normal. Couldn't be normal. My hands were shaking as I made instant ramen, needing something warm and familiar. The rational part of my brain, the part that had a degree from Boston University, kept offering explanations. A hunter in dark clothing, trick of the light, digital artifact. But hunters don't move like that. And the light doesn't lie, not consistently across 23 frames of video. I pulled up Google Earth and marked my exact position from that evening using the GPS data embedded in the footage. The nearest trail was a quarter mile from where the figure had been. The terrain in between was steep, thick with undergrowth. No casual hiker would be bushwhacking through there at dusk. Sleep wasn't happening, not after what I'd seen. Instead, I went down the rabbit hole, searching for anything unusual reported in the Northeast Kingdom. Started with Vermont wildlife and Peachum bear sightings, normal stuff. But the suggested searches at the bottom of the page led me somewhere else entirely. Vermont Bigfoot sightings, Northeast Kingdom cryptid, Peachum missing hunters. I told myself I was being ridiculous as I clicked the pie. First link, then the second, then I couldn't stop. Report after report, some dating back decades. Knocking sounds in the forest, twisted trees, massive footprints. A thru hiker in 1992 who described being followed for 3 days by something that stayed just out of sight. A hunting party in 1978 that abandoned their camp after something threw rocks at their tent all night. Most compelling was a Forest Service report from 1987. 2 rangers investigating unauthorized structures near Burke Mountain. The report cut off mid-sentence, marked as classified. No follow-up, no explanation. I was still reading when dawn light crept through the windows, my eyes burning from staring at the screen all night. I should have left that morning. Packed my gear, invented a family emergency, and driven back to Boston, but I didn't. Part of it was professional pride. I'd never bailed on an assignment. Part was financial. I needed this paycheck. But mostly, I think, it was curiosity. That same impulse that makes people slow down at accident scenes or watch horror movies. I had to know. The forums I'd found during the night were treasure troves of local history nobody talked about publicly. A user named Vermont Truth had compiled reports going back to the 1800s. Native American stories about the stone giants who lived in the high places. French trappers who refused to work certain valleys. Logging camps abandoned overnight with no explanation. More recent accounts were eerily consistent. The knocking sounds always in sets of 3. Trees bent and woven into patterns that weren't quite random but weren't quite purposeful either. The silence that descended like a blanket before something happened. And the smell, described over and over as a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky. Almost human, but not quite. I found a topographical map someone had marked with incident locations. My cabin sat right in the center of the cluster, the epicenter of 40 years of reports. The ridgelines Frank had warned me about were highlighted in red with a simple notation. Active area avoid. A post from 2018 stopped me cold. A photographer, just like me, hired to shoot promotional material for a hiking guide. He'd lasted 4 days before what he described as a coordinated intimidation campaign drove him out. Rocks thrown at his tent with accuracy no human could achieve in darkness. His expensive camera equipment rearranged while he slept. And on his final night, something pressed against his tent wall. Breathing so heavily, the fabric moved in and out like a lung. "It wanted me gone," he wrote. And I obliged. His photos were attached to the post, blurry, mostly useless, except for one. A clear handprint on a dusty window, too large to be human, with dermal ridges visible in the morning light. The post had 3 comments, all calling him a fraud, but I recognized the window. It was the bedroom window in my cabin. I spent the morning in St. Johnsbury, buying things that made me feel marginally safer. More batteries for my lights, an air horn, extra memory cards, bear spray, though I doubted it would help against something that could throw rocks in the dark with sniper accuracy. The camping store clerk, a kid maybe 19, noticed my nervous energy. "Heading into the backcountry?" he asked, working near Peacham. Photography assignment. His expression shifted. "Oh, you staying at Frank's cabin?" I nodded. "My uncle stayed there once, deer hunting, made it 2 nights. He glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer. "You seen anything weird yet?" "Define weird." "You'll know it when it happens. My uncle, he's not scared of anything. Came back from Iraq. Works as a state trooper now. But whatever he saw up there, he won't talk about it. Just says the woods up there belong to something else. I bought a satellite phone on impulse. The kid threw in some chemical light sticks for free. Wouldn't take no for an answer." The drive back to the cabin felt like returning to a crime scene. Every shadow between the trees could hide something watching. The logging road seemed narrower, the forest more oppressive. When I parked in the clearing, I sat in the car for a full minute, engine running, before forcing myself to get out. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Laptop still open to the forum posts. Coffee cup still half full of cold liquid. But something felt different. A presence, like the cabin itself, was holding its breath. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. It was 3 p.m. Golden hour would start soon. I had work to do, a client to satisfy. But my hands shook as I loaded fresh batteries into the camera. I wasn't going far from the cabin. Not today. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure moving through the trees in my footage. Every settling of the cabin's old timbers sounded like footsteps. Around 2 a.m., I gave up pretending and sat at the kitchen table with all the lights on, my laptop open to the forum posts, the satellite phone within reach. That's when the footsteps started. Not the random creaking of an old structure, deliberate, measured impacts on the porch boards. Something heavy was circling the cabin. The footfalls would pause at each window, and I could hear breathing. Deep, rhythmic, like a massive bellows working. The sound made something primitive in my brain scream to run, but there was nowhere to go. I grabbed my headlamp and the Canon, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Through the front window, the beam illuminated nothing but empty porch and forest beyond. The footsteps continued, now at the side of the cabin. I ran to that window. Nothing. But the breathing was right there, just outside the wall. So close, I could hear the wet sound of exhalation. Then came the knocks. 3 impacts against the cabin's frame, so forceful the dishes rattled in the cupboards. Not random, deliberate, purposeful. The whole structure vibrated like a drum. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. Bears don't knock. Neither do moose or any other wildlife I knew. The motion-activated trail camera I'd set up near the tree line started triggering. I could see its infrared flash through the window, firing again and again. Whatever was out there was moving around the clearing, setting it off repeatedly. Good, I thought. Evidence. Proof I wasn't losing my mind. The breathing moved to the back door. I heard the handle rattle, a testing experimental sound, like someone checking if it was locked. The door held, but the message was clear. Whatever was outside understood doors, understood locks, was intelligent enough to test barriers. A sound from the bedroom made my blood freeze. Tapping on. Glass. Rhythmic. Almost playful. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to move, to look. The bedroom window showed only darkness and my own terrified reflection. But the tapping continued. And now, I could see the glass vibrating slightly with each impact. I grabbed the air horn I'd bought and gave it a long blast. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The tapping stopped immediately. So did the breathing. For maybe 30 seconds, absolute silence. Then, from somewhere in the forest, came an answering sound, not an air horn, but something mimicking its pitch and duration, like a mockery of my attempt at defense. The rest of the night passed in hypervigilant terror. Every few minutes, I'd hear movement outside. A branch breaking. Something brushing against the walls. Once, I swear I heard a low vocalization, almost like speech, but not quite. Tones and rhythms that suggested language without forming words. Dawn came slowly, gray light creeping through the trees. Only when full sunlight hit the clearing did I finally venture outside. My hands were still shaking as I retrieved the trail camera's memory card. Back inside, I plugged it into my laptop, desperate to see what it had captured. File after file showed nothing but darkness with error messages, corrupted data, unreadable format. Dozens of triggered events, all destroyed, except one. A partial image, maybe 3 seconds of footage before corruption. It showed a hand, massive, covered in dark hair, reaching toward the camera. The fingers were thick, but unmistakably articulated. Human-like, but wrong. Too long, too powerful. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was part of a face. Just the edge, high cheekbone, heavy brow, one eye reflecting the infrared like a cat's. I sat staring at that image until my coffee went cold, trying to process what it meant. This wasn't a bear. Wasn't any known animal. This was something else. Something that knocked on doors and understood. Cameras. Something that had been watching me all along. The morning after that endless night revealed evidence I couldn't explain away. I walked the perimeter of the cabin in disbelief, my camera documenting everything even though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The prints were everywhere, pressed deep into the soft earth, clear as plaster casts. 18 inches long, maybe 8 inches wide. 5 toes clearly visible, with what looked like a mid-tarsal break, a flexible point in the middle of the foot that humans don't have. The stride length was impossible, nearly 6 feet between steps. I placed my size 10 boot next to one print for scale and had to step back. The comparison was absurd. Whatever made these tracks would dwarf any human. I'd seen plenty of bear prints over the years. Black bears leave a distinctive pattern, 5 toes, yes, but with claws clearly visible and a different overall shape. These prints showed no claw marks. The toe arrangement was almost human, with a clear big toe offset like our own, but the proportions were all wrong. Too wide, too deep. The weight distribution suggested something walking fully upright, not the pigeon-toed walk of a bear. My heavy Yeti cooler sat 20 feet from where I'd left it, lid open, contents gone. Not scattered around like a bear would do, simply gone. The ratchet straps I'd used to secure it were unfastened, not broken or chewed through, unfastened. The mechanism required opposable thumbs and an understanding of how to release tension before unhooking. I checked the straps carefully. No damage, no teeth marks, just opened with deliberate precision. The rational part of my brain kept trying to find explanations. Maybe a person? But who would walk barefoot through the Vermont woods in October, leaving prints that size? And the depth of the impressions, I did rough calculations based on the soil compression. Whatever made them weigh at least 500 pounds, probably more. I spent an hour photographing the prints from every angle, using different lenses, placing various objects for scale, a measuring tape, my tripod, my coffee mug. The morning sun cast perfect shadows into the depressions, highlighting every detail. These weren't hoaxes made with wooden feet. I could see dermal ridges in the clearest prints, the kind of skin patterns that are as unique as fingerprints. Around the back of the cabin, I found something else. Scratches on a pine tree, about 9 feet up, too high for me to reach, even on tiptoes. 4 parallel gouges in the bark, fresh enough that sap was still weeping from them. Not claw marks, the spacing was wrong. More like something had gripped the tree and pulled, testing its strength, maybe. I should have left then. Packed up, driven away, made excuses to my client about equipment failure or illness. But standing there in the morning light, surrounded by evidence of something impossible, I made a decision that still haunts me. I decided to stay. To document, to find proof. Part of it was professional pride. I'd photographed dangerous animals before. Part was scientific curiosity. If this was real, if something like this existed, it would change everything. But mostly, I think I stayed because I had to know. The not knowing would have eaten at me forever. I spent the rest of the morning repositioning my cameras. The trail cam went up higher, harder to reach. I set up the thermal imaging camera on a tripod inside, aimed through the window at the tree line. The Zoom H6 audio recorder was placed outside under the porch eave, protected but able to capture any sounds. By noon, I had a perimeter of equipment around the cabin. Cameras at different angles and heights, motion sensors, even simple thread lines at various heights that would break if something passed through. If whatever this was came back, I'd be ready. I told myself I was being scientific, methodical. But the truth was, I was terrified and trying to take control of something uncontrollable. The woods around the cabin felt different now, charged, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Whatever had visited in the night would return. I was certain of it, and I'd be waiting. The next 2 days became a strange game of call and response with something I couldn't see. It started when I decided to test what I'd read in those forum posts about wood knocks. The idea seemed ridiculous in daylight, standing at the edge of the clearing with a heavy stick, hitting a dead pine like some primitive telegraph operator. My first attempts felt foolish. 3 solid strikes against the trunk, the sound echoing briefly before the forest swallowed it. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. I was about to give up when, from somewhere to the north, came 3 answering knocks, perfectly spaced, same rhythm I'd used. The hair on my arms stood up. I knocked again, this time varying the pattern too. Quick, 1 slow. 10 seconds passed. Then from the northeast, closer than before, the exact pattern repeated back. My mouth went dry. This wasn't an echo. Something was deliberately responding. Over the next hour, I mapped responses from at least 4 different directions. Sometimes the knocks came immediately, sometimes after long pauses, as if whatever was out there was considering whether to answer. The sounds moved, circled, came closer, then retreated. Once, a series of knocks came from directly above, impossible unless something was in the canopy, 40 feet up in the pines. Between knock sessions, I explored the trails with new purpose, looking for physical evidence. About half a mile from the cabin, 30 feet off the marked trail, I found the first structure. 3 saplings, each as thick as my wrist, bent and woven together into an arch about 7 feet tall. Not broken, bent while alive and held in place by precise weaving. The engineering required to bend green wood, that severely without snapping, it was considerable. I found 4 more structures over 2 days. Some were simple arches, others more complex trees twisted together in patterns that seemed almost artistic. One formation used 6 different saplings to create something like a dome frame. All were too high to be snow damage, too systematic to be natural, too remote to be hikers playing around. The audio equipment picked up something even stranger. My Zoom H6, set to record continuously, captured frequencies I couldn't hear with my naked ear. When I analyzed the files on my laptop, I found consistent infrasound patterns below 20 Hz, below human hearing range. The same frequencies elephants use for long-distance communication. The same frequencies that cause unexplained anxiety in humans, that feeling of being watched when nothing's visible. The infrasound came in patterns, almost like language. Repetitive sequences that suggested communication rather than random noise. When I played them back at higher speeds to bring them into audible range, they sounded like deep, modulated groans. During peak activity, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., the recording showed multiple sources, as if several creatures were having a conversation just below human perception. The physical effects were real. When the infrasound was strongest, my chest cavity would resonate, creating a feeling of pressure and unease. My heart rate elevated. That primitive fight or flight response kicked in hard. It wasn't supernatural, it was physics. Something was communicating at frequencies designed to affect humans on a visceral level. On the second afternoon, I tried something different. I played back some of the recorded knocks through a portable speaker, amplified. The forest exploded with responsive knocks from every direction, some so close I could hear wood splinters falling. Then, absolute silence for 3 hours. Nothing responded to my calls after that. I'd crossed. Some line, violated some protocol I didn't understand. That evening, reviewing thermal footage from the previous night, I saw them clearly for the first time. 3 heat signatures, each massive, moving through the trees with coordinated precision. They stayed exactly at the thermal camera's maximum range, never closer, as if they knew the equipment's limitations. Whatever was out there wasn't just intelligent. It was studying me as carefully as I was trying to study it. I needed supplies and, honestly, human contact. The isolation was getting to me. 3 days of knocks and shadows and thermal signatures had left me jumpy, exhausted. The drive to town felt like emerging from deep water, the normal world rushing back as I descended from the cabin's elevation. The general store in Danville sat at the intersection of Route 2 and Hill Street, a converted farmhouse with gas pumps that probably hadn't been updated since the 80s. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and motor oil felt like salvation. Normal people buying normal things. No mysterious knocks, no impossible footprints. I loaded a basket with canned soup, batteries, instant coffee. At the counter, making small talk with the owner, a bearded guy named Roger, I mentioned I was staying up near Peacham doing photography work. "Frank's cabin?" he asked, his smile faltering slightly. "That's the one. Beautiful area." The store went quiet. An elderly man nursing coffee at the single table by the window looked up sharply. A woman examining bread turned to stare. Roger's hand paused over the register keys. "How long you staying?" Roger asked carefully. "Another week and a half, maybe." "Why?" The old man stood up slowly, leaving his coffee unfinished. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, deep lines carved by sun and wind. He walked over, and I noticed he unconsciously rubbed a scar on his forearm. 4 parallel lines, old but deep. "You should finish. Early," he said quietly. "Weather's turning bad soon." I checked my phone. The forecast showed clear skies for the next week. "Looks pretty good to me." He leaned closer. I could smell pipe tobacco and coffee on his breath. "The weather up there ain't what comes from the sky, son. Some places don't want company. That cabin's one of them." Before I could respond, he walked out, the bell above the door chiming his departure. Roger busied himself with the register, not meeting my eyes. The woman with the bread had vanished down an aisle. "Don't mind Earl," a young voice said behind me. I turned to find a college-aged woman with Roger's same brown eyes, his daughter, clearly. He tells those stories to everyone. "Stories?" She glanced at her father, who had found something urgent to do in the back room. "Local folklore. You know how small towns are." She lowered her voice. "But if you're interested in the history up there, I might have something." She disappeared into a sea, door marked "Employees Only," and returned with a photocopied handful of pages, aged and yellow. My grandfather's journal from 1962. He had the hunting camp next to where Frank's cabin is now. She pressed the pages into my hand. He sold it real sudden after that October. Never said why. The pages were handwritten, faded but legible. I saw dates, sketches that might have been maps, and one drawing that made my stomach drop, a rough illustration of a footprint with measurements noted beside it. 18 inches, 5 toes. Mid-tarsal break clearly indicated. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. She looked toward the back room where her father had disappeared. Because Earl's brother disappeared up there in 71. Because my grandfather had a breakdown and spent his last years talking about things in the woods. Because every few years, someone stays in that cabin and comes back wrong, if they come back at all. She grabbed my receipt and wrote something. On the back, a phone number. "I'm home from UVM for fall break, environmental science major. I've been mapping the incidents for a folklore project." She kept her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a pattern. October's always the worst. They're most active then." "They?" She started to answer, then saw her father returning. Her expression shifted to a bright customer service smile. "Have a great day. Enjoy the foliage." I drove back toward the cabin with the journal pages on the passenger seat, her number in my pocket, and Earl's warning echoing in my head. The weather up there ain't what comes from the sky. I should have turned around, driven straight back to Boston. Instead, I drove up that logging road, back to the cabin, back to whatever was waiting in those woods. Because I had to know. The drive back from town felt wrong from the start. The grandfather's journal pages sat on the passenger seat, and I kept glancing at them at every stop sign. October 14th, 1962. Found tracks, again near the upper ridge, 18 inches, clear as day, in the mud. Showed them to nobody. Who would believe? October 16th. They're getting bolder. Came right up to the camp last night. Could smell them through the walls, wet dog and something else. something wild. By the time I reached the logging road, the sun was already low, casting long shadows through the trees. The familiar bump and grind up to the cabin felt different now, like driving into a trap. When I parked in the clearing, I sat for a moment with the engine running, that animal part of my brain screaming at me to reverse, to leave, to never come back. But I didn't. I grabbed my supplies and the journal and went inside. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. Laptop closed on the table, coffee cup in the sink, equipment bags lined against the wall. Everything normal. Except it wasn't. Little things were off. My lens cap, which I always place threads up, was threads down. The chair at the table was pulled out at a different angle. The stack of memory cards I'd left squared up was now slightly fanned. I checked the doors. Still locked. Windows latched. No sign of forced entry. But something had been inside. Something with enough intelligence to enter without breaking anything, to examine my belongings, to leave signs so subtle I might have missed them if I wasn't looking. The laptop was the worst part. When I opened it, it was already on. I always shut it down completely to save battery. The screen showed my photo folder from day 3, the one with the figure in the trees. The images were displayed in slideshow mode, cycling through exactly the frames where the creature appeared. 23 specific photos out of hundreds from that day. My hands shook as I checked the metadata. The files had been accessed at 3:17 a.m., when I'd been sleeping not 20 feet away. Something had been in here with me, using my computer, studying the images I'd captured of it. The thought made my skin crawl. I went through everything, methodically. My camera gear had been handled, I could tell by the way the straps were coiled differently. The thermal camera had been moved, its angle adjusted. But nothing was damaged or missing. It was like a careful inventory had been taken, an assessment of my capabilities. The food was the strangest part. My supplies had been reorganized. All the canned goods moved to one shelf, dried foods to another. The protein bars I'd bought were unwrapped and rewrapped, each one examined. One was missing, but its wrapper was folded neatly and placed on the counter. Whatever had been here had tasted my food, tested it, then cleaned up after itself. I found the first message just before dark. On the window above the kitchen sink, drawn in the dust on the outside of the glass, was a perfect handprint. Too large to be human, fingers too long, but undeniably deliberate. Placed at eye level, where I couldn't miss it. The second message was worse. My printed photos from the first 3 days, the ones I'd selected as potential submissions, had been spread across the spare bedroom floor in a pattern. They formed a rough circle with one image in the center, the clearest shot of the figure in the trees. Around it, the other photos were arranged by location, creating a map of where I'd been hiking. Red leaves from outside were placed on specific photos, marking spots. When I plotted those marked locations on my actual topographical map, they formed a boundary. A clear line I'd crossed repeatedly. The message was unmistakable. You've been trespassing. I sat on the floor staring at that pattern until full darkness fell, understanding finally that I wasn't the observer here. I was the one being studied. That night, I set up the thermal camera on its tripod, positioned at the kitchen window with a clear view of the tree line. The FLIR wasn't cheap. I'd bought it used, from a hunting guide who'd upgraded, but it was military grade, capable of detecting heat signatures out to 300 meters. If anything warm-blooded moved out there, I'd see it. By 9 p.m., I had my first contact. A heat signature emerged from the forest, roughly 50 meters from the cabin. The shape was unmistakably bipedal, standing at least 7 feet tall based on the trees nearby for reference. It stood perfectly still for 5 minutes, just watching. The thermal image showed a body temperature slightly lower than human normal, maybe 95 degrees, but the mass was all wrong. The torso was barrel-shaped, too thick for any human proportions. Then a second figure appeared, slightly smaller, joining the first. They stood together, and I swear I could see them communicating small movements of the hands, tilts of the head. Not random fidgeting, but deliberate gestures. After 10 minutes, they separated, one moving north, one south, beginning what looked like a patrol pattern around the clearing. I started recording, my hands steady now that I had something concrete to document. This wasn't shadows or imagination. This was heat, mass, movement, undeniable physical presence. The thermal couldn't lie about what was out there. A third figure appeared at 10:30, larger than the other two. This one came closer, maybe 30 meters from the cabin, and stood facing my window directly. Through the thermal, I could see it swaying slightly. a rhythmic movement that seemed almost hypnotic. The heat signature showed it was massive. The software estimated at least 600 pounds based on the thermal mass. It stood there for 43 minutes, not hiding, not trying to approach, just standing in plain view, swaying gently, watching me watch it. The behavior was so deliberate, so calculated. It knew I was filming. It wanted me to film. This was some kind of demonstration, though I couldn't understand the purpose. Around midnight, all three figures converged near the tree line. They arranged themselves in a triangle formation, and the swaying began again, synchronized this time. The FLIR showed their body temperatures fluctuating in unison, rising and falling by several degrees in waves. I'd never seen anything like it in any mammal. It was like they could control their metabolic rate at will. Then they began to vocalize. Not the wood knocks from before, but actual vocalizations pitched so low I felt them more than heard them. The thermal showed the air vibrating between them, infrared patterns of sound waves I could see but not properly hear. My chest cavity resonated with the frequency, that same anxious feeling from before, but stronger, more directed. The laptop on the table behind me chirped. New Wi-Fi network detected. I turned confused. There was no Wi-Fi up here except my phone's hotspot, which was off. The network name showed as a string of numbers, 44.9733 negative, 72.1667. I recognized the format immediately, GPS coordinates. When I entered them into my mapping software, they pointed to a location about 2 miles north of the cabin, high on the ridgeline Frank had warned me about. I turned back to the thermal camera. All three figures were gone. The forest was empty, showing only the baseline temperature of trees and ground. But the message was clear. They were inviting me somewhere, or warning me away from it. Either way, they just demonstrated they understood our technology well enough to use it. I kept watch until dawn, but they didn't return. The thermal footage was all there, saved to multiple memory cards. Undeniable proof that something intelligent was out there. Something that could control its body temperature, coordinate complex behaviors, and even manipulate our wireless signals. Something that wanted me to know it was watching. I knew it was my last night in the cabin. My assignment technically had another week, but after what I documented, after those GPS coordinates appearing on my laptop, I'd made the decision to leave at first light. The magazine would get their foliage shots from what I'd already captured. This had gone far beyond any assignment. I was packing my equipment, carefully wrapping the thermal camera, when I heard it breathing against the window. Not the kitchen window where I'd been watching. The bedroom window, right behind me. I turned slowly, my headlamp beam sweeping across the glass. The face was right there, inches from the pane. I've tried 1,000 times to describe what I saw in that moment, and words always fail. The features were almost human-high cheekbones, a heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes, but everything was wrong in proportion. The face was too wide, the jaw too heavy, the skin covered in fine dark hair that wasn't quite fur. It was like looking at something that had taken a different evolutionary path, something that shared an ancestor with us millions of years ago, but had become something else entirely. The eyes were the worst part. They reflected green in my headlamp beam, like a nocturnal predator, but behind that reflection was unmistakable intelligence. This wasn't an animal looking at me. This was a being, a consciousness, studying me with the same intensity I'd been studying it. We stayed frozen like that for maybe 10 seconds that felt like hours. Then it exhaled, and its breath fogged the window completely, obscuring its features. When the condensation cleared, I could see it had pulled back slightly, enough for me to see more of its body. Massive shoulders, arms longer than any human should be, and a hand rising toward the glass. It pressed its palm flat against the window. The hand was enormous, twice the width of mine, with thick fingers that looked powerful enough to snap trees. But the gesture wasn't threatening. It was almost communicative, like it wanted me to match it. To press my hand against the glass in return, I had my cannon in my other hand. One movement, and I could capture the shot of a lifetime. Absolute proof. The image that would change everything we thought we knew about what lived in these forests. My finger found the shutter button. The creature's eyes tracked to the camera, and something in its expression changed. Not anger exactly, but disappointment, like I'd failed some kind of test. It pulled its hand back slowly and shook its head, a completely human gesture that looked alien on that impossible face. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I lowered the camera, set it on the dresser behind me without breaking eye contact. Then I raised my empty hand, showing my palm in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then, deliberately, it pressed its palm against the glass again. This time I understood. I walked forward slowly, my legs shaking, and placed my hand against the window, matching its position. The glass between us was cold, and I could feel a vibration through it. The creature was humming at a frequency so low I felt it in my bones more than heard it. Its hand dwarfed mine completely. Through the glass, I could see the dermal ridges on its palm, the lines and whorls that were so similar to human fingerprints but scaled up to impossible size. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds, two species acknowledging each other across an impossible divide. Then it pulled back, gave what might have been a nod, and turned away. I watched its massive form disappear into the darkness between the trees, moving with that same fluid grace I'd seen in my footage days ago. I stood at that window until my legs gave out, then sat on the floor until dawn. The handprint remained on the window when the sun finally rose, perfectly preserved in the oils and moisture from its skin. I could see every ridge, every line, captured like evidence at a crime scene. Except there was no crime here, just a moment of contact between two intelligences that weren't supposed to meet. I packed frantically as soon as there was enough light, throwing equipment into bags without the usual care. Every sound from the forest made me jump. The understanding we'd reached the night before felt fragile, conditional. I'd been given permission to leave, but I sensed that permission had an expiration time. The thermal camera's memory cards went into a waterproof case that I tucked into my jacket. The regular camera cards went into another case in a different pocket. The audio recordings onto a backup drive that I wrapped in a shirt and buried in my backpack. I was distributing the evidence in case something happened, in case I had to run and leave bags behind. As I carried the first load to the Subaru, I found more prints in the frost-covered ground, a trail of them leading from the forest to the bedroom window, then circling the entire cabin multiple times. But there were other tracks too, smaller ones, including what looked like juvenile prints, maybe 10 inches long. It hadn't been alone last night. The whole family group had been there, watching our interaction. I was loading the last bag when I heard branches breaking in the forest. Not subtle movement, something large was coming directly toward the cabin. I froze with one hand on the car door, keys clutched in the other. The crashing got closer, and I could hear breathing now, heavy and rhythmic. It emerged at the tree line and stopped, staying just within the shadows. Even in daylight, I could only make out its outline, massive, upright, swaying slightly. We regarded each other across the clearing for a long moment. Then it raised one hand, palm out, the same gesture I'd made the night before. I raised my hand in return, and it lowered its arm and stepped backward, melting into the forest shadows. The message was clear. Our interaction was over. Time to leave. I drove down the logging road faster than was safe, the Subaru's suspension protesting over every rut and rock. At the bottom, where the road met Route 2, I pulled over and sat there shaking for 10 minutes. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my client, probably wondering why I hadn't uploaded photos in 2 days. I didn't care. Looking back up the mountain, I could see nothing but innocent-looking forest, autumn colors brilliant in the morning sun. No hint of what lived up there, what watched from those trees. I pulled out my camera and reviewed the images from last night. I had dozens of shots from earlier, the footprints, the structures, even some blurry thermal stills. But from the moment of contact, when it had stood at my window, I had nothing. The camera had been recording, but every file from those crucial minutes was corrupted, just digital noise. Except for one. A single frame that had somehow survived, showing just the handprint on the glass, lit by the sunrise. No face, no body, just that impossible hand's impression. Proof that something had been there, but not enough to show what. I sat there for another 5 minutes, engine running, heat blasting to stop my shivering. Then I put the car in drive and headed south, the weight of what I'd experienced settling over me like a heavy blanket. The evidence was all there, in my bags, thermal footage, audio recordings, photographs of tracks and structures. Everything except the one image that would have proved it all beyond doubt. The shot I'd chosen not to take. I drove straight through to Burlington, only stopping once for gas, constantly checking my mirrors as if something might be following. But the roads stayed empty except for normal traffic. By the time I reached the interstate, The whole experience was already starting to feel unreal, like a vivid dream fading in daylight. But the handprint on the glass had left an oily residue. When I finally stopped and checked, it was still there on my palm. A reminder that it had all been real. The Vermont Fish and Wildlife Office in Waterbury sat in a converted Victorian house, all dark wood and narrow hallways that smelled like old paper and coffee. I'd called ahead, said I had evidence of unusual wildlife activity near Peacham. The receptionist sounded bored until I mentioned thermal footage. Then suddenly I had an appointment that afternoon. 3 officials sat across from me in a conference room that had probably been a dining room once. 2 men in their 50s who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and a woman, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair, pulled back tight. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to her nameplate. Large mammal specialist. I started with the footprint photos, laying them out on the table with my measuring tape clearly visible for scale. The older of the 2 men, introduced as Regional Director Thompson, barely glanced at them. Black bear, he said immediately. Walking through soft mud can distort the print, make it look bigger, more human-like. Bears have claws, I pointed out. These don't. And the toe arrangement. Pareidolia, the other man interrupted. Williams, the field supervisor. The human brain's tendency to see patterns that aren't there. Same reason people see faces in clouds. I pulled out my laptop and showed them the thermal footage. 3 heat signatures, clearly bipedal, moving in coordination. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, but Thompson waved his hand dismissively. Hunters. Poachers, maybe, using the cover of darkness. Hunters that are 7 feet tall and can control their body temperature? The equipment could be malfunctioning. Thermal cameras are notoriously unreliable in certain atmospheric conditions. Williams pulled out his phone, already checking messages. Stress and isolation can create powerful misidentifications, Mr. Round. Reeves, it's more common than you'd think. I played the audio recordings. The infrasound patterns, the wood knocks. Thompson actually laughed. Trees falling, wood settling in temperature changes. Maybe a woodpecker with insomnia. He stood up, meeting over. Look, we appreciate citizens reporting unusual activity, but what you're suggesting, it's simply not possible. Vermont's large mammal population is well documented. Bears, moose, deer. Nothing else. Williams was already at the door. Thompson gathered his papers. But Dr. Chen remained seated, studying the thermal footage I'd paused on screen. She waited until both men had left, then looked at me directly. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment. "Leave your contact information with reception," she said quietly. Then, louder, "We'll file your report with the others." Others, plural. As I packed up my evidence, she stood and moved closer, pretending to examine one of the footprint photos. "That thermal footage," she whispered. "I'd like copies. For personal research. Academic purposes." Her voice dropped even lower. "And Mr. Reeves? Don't publicize the exact location." "Not yet." "Why?" She glanced at the door, then back at me. Her hand unconsciously moved to her pocket where I could see the outline of bear spray, always carrying it, even in the office. "Reports like yours have increased dramatically over the past 5 years. Not just Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, parts of New York." She maintained eye contact too long, like she was trying to communicate something she couldn't say out loud. "My predecessor quit suddenly after a field incident in '98. Never said what happened, but he left all his files. Boxes of them." "What do the files say?" "Officially? Nothing. Black bears. Misidentification. Stress." She picked up her folder, preparing to leave. "Unofficially? Patterns. Migration, maybe. Population expansion. Something's changing in these forests." She wrote something on her business card and handed it to her direct line, and on the back, a single word. "Careful." At the door, she paused. "Mr. Reeves? That decision not to take the photo, when you had the chance? That's probably why you're standing here instead of..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Instead of what?" "Missing, like the others who got too close." She left me standing there, evidence in hand, officially dismissed, but privately believed. Home didn't feel like home anymore. My apartment in Cambridge, with its brick walls and city noise, felt like another planet after what I'd experienced in Vermont. I tried to return to normal assignments, a corporate headshot session, a wedding, a magazine spread about urban gardens, but I couldn't focus. Couldn't shoot in any location with trees without constantly checking the shadows. The handprint haunted me. I'd preserved it between two pieces of museum-quality glass, sealed at the edges, and kept it in my closet where I wouldn't have to look at it every day. But I knew it was there. Proof that I hadn't imagined everything. I sent the thermal footage to a colleague at MIT who specialized in imaging analysis. He called me 3 hours later. "Where did you get this?" Dr. Marcus Webb's voice was strained. "Vermont. Wildlife assignment. This isn't any animal in the taxonomic database. The heat signature, the mass distribution, the locomotion patterns. Christophe, what is this?" "I was hoping you could tell me." Long pause. "Can I keep this? Show it to some colleagues? Privately, I mean. No names attached." "Why privately?" "Because if this is real, if this isn't some elaborate hoax, then..." Another pause. "Then we need to reconsider everything we think we know about North American wildlife. Maybe about human evolution itself." 3 weeks later, he called again, this time at 2 a.m. "Delete the files," he said without preamble. "Whatever you saw, whatever you think you documented, delete it all." "Marcus, what happened?" "I showed it to the wrong person. Now there are people asking questions. Federal people. They want the originals, want to know the exact location, want your name." His voice cracked. I told them it was a hoax, that I'd been fooled. But Christophe, they already knew. They knew about Vermont, about that specific area. They have their own files. The line went dead. Marcus never returned my calls after that. I started having nightmares. Not about being attacked or hunted, but about that moment at the window. The creature's disappointed expression when I raised the camera. The intelligence in its eyes. The choice it made not to harm me after I lowered it. In the dreams, I always took the photo. And things always ended differently. My girlfriend left after 2 months of me waking up, screaming, checking windows obsessively, refusing to take any assignment that involved forests. I couldn't explain without sounding insane. How do you tell someone that you've seen something that's not supposed to exist? That you have proof locked in a safety deposit box, the memory card from that final night that I still haven't had the courage to view? Work dried up. Word spreads in the photography community when you start turning down jobs, showing up exhausted, jumping at shadows. The magazine that had hired me for the Vermont assignment complained about the incomplete submission, though they grudgingly accepted what I'd shot in the first 3 days. I started attending a support group for PTSD, telling them I'd had a wildlife encounter that left me shaken. It helped. A little. The therapist talked about integration, about accepting traumatic experiences without letting them define you. But she didn't know about the package that would arrive 6 months later. I threw myself into urban photography, documenting city life where the only shadows were from buildings, where the night sounds were traffic and human voices. I told myself I was healing, moving on, that Vermont was behind me. But sometimes, walking past a park at dusk, I'd catch a whiff of something wet earth and pine and something musky, and I'd be right back at that window, hand pressed against the glass, feeling that impossible vibration through my bones. The truth was, I'd never really left those woods. Part of me was still there, frozen in that moment of contact, forever changed by what I'd seen, and what had seen me. The package arrived on a rainy April morning, 6 months after Vermont. No return address, no postage marks, just my name written in block letters on brown paper. It had been slipped under my apartment door sometime during the night. My security camera, which should have caught whoever delivered it, showed only static from 3 a.m. to 3:15. Inside was my trail camera's SD card, the one I thought I'd lost in my frantic packing that final morning. But this wasn't the corrupted mess I'd found before. These files were crystal clear, timestamp starting. For my first night at the cabin, I sat on my couch, laptop warming my legs, rain pattering against the windows, and watched my entire week unfold from perspectives I'd never known existed. The camera hadn't just been triggered randomly. It had been repositioned each night, deliberately, to capture specific angles. The first files showed me arriving at the cabin, unloading gear, that false confidence I'd had in the beginning. But in the background, barely visible in the tree line, were shapes, watching from day one. They'd been there the entire time, studying my routines, learning my patterns. Night 2 showed 3 of them examining my Subaru while I slept. One ran its hands over the hood, feeling the residual engine heat. Another pressed its face against the driver's side window, breath fogging the glass. The third went through my equipment in the back, handling each lens with surprising delicacy. They communicated in gestures, pointing at the cabin, at the cameras, at each other. The footage from night 4 was the worst. I watched myself through the kitchen window, editing photos on my laptop, completely oblivious to the massive figure standing just 3 feet behind the glass. It stood there for 2 hours, matching my movements sometimes, tilting its head when I tilted mine, learning, mimicking. But it was the final night's footage that made me close the laptop and walk to the bathroom to throw up. The camera had been positioned high in a tree, looking down at the cabin. It showed not 3, but at least a dozen of them, arranged in a loose circle around the clearing. Adults, juveniles, even what looked like infants carried by their mothers. An entire family group, maybe multiple families, gathered to witness our contact. When I'd stood at that window, hand pressed against the glass, I hadn't been interacting with one creature. I'd been presenting myself to an entire community. They'd all been watching, evaluating, making some collective decision about whether I was a threat. The very last file was different, recent, dated just 2 days ago. It showed my apartment building at night, zoomed in on my bedroom window from across the street. The image held for 30 seconds, then panned down to the sidewalk, where a familiar, massive figure stood under a streetlight. It looked directly at the camera and held up one hand, the same gesture it had made when I left Vermont. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into Boston Commons' dark trees. The message was clear. They knew where I lived. They could find me anywhere. But this wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. A reminder that I'd been allowed to leave, allowed to live, allowed to tell this story. But that permission came with boundaries. At the bottom of the package was a single photo, not digital, but printed, old-fashioned film stock. It showed the GPS coordinates they'd sent to my laptop that night, the location on the ridgeline I'd never visited. The image revealed a cave entrance, ancient and worn, surrounded by those bent tree structures I'd found, but dozens of them, creating an elaborate perimeter, their home, their sacred space, the place I'd been warned away from. I understood then why I was still alive. I'd shown respect. I'd recognized the intelligence behind those eyes. I'd chosen not to violate that final boundary, not to turn them into a spectacle. And in return, they'd let me go with evidence, with a story, but not with anything that could bring harm to them. I still have everything: the thermal footage, the audio recordings, the handprint preserved between glass plates. Sometimes researchers contact me, having heard rumors. Occasionally, someone who's had their own encounter reaches out, desperate to know they're not crazy. I share what I can, what feels safe. But that final memory card, the one from the night at the window, stays locked away. Some things are meant to be witnessed but not shared. Some boundaries are marked by more than signs and fences. They're marked by mutual respect between species that were never meant to meet. I never went back to Vermont, never took another wilderness assignment. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I catch myself looking out windows, wondering if they're still watching. Wondering if that raised hand was goodbye or just until next time. The truth is, I don't want to know.